welcome everyone. I'm excited to talk to you about this. I think this has such a huge impact on our work, and it's often very implicit. So we experience it, we sense it, we hold it in our bodies, in our thoughts, in our relationships, but we don't always, we're not always able to name it. There's going to be kind of two parts I talk about. So one is individually, kind of what you can do, what it is, what you can do about it. And then I'm also going to talk about the organizational thing. And one of the things we know is that with something like vicarious trauma, the thing that usually has the biggest impact is the organizational approaches. So absolutely, we want to give people the tools to manage things on their own, because that tends to be what we have control over. And, organizational change can be a tough road to go down, and there has to be a lot of intention behind it and a lot of buy-in and all those kinds of things. So we want all those things to happen. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A. I believe that's anonymous, or into chat. And Chris is gonna jump on and kind of talk about it as like feed it back to me as we go. Also, if something comes up for you and you want more of a private conversation, feel free to contact me. My info is on the last slide, and it's on the bottom of most of the slides. I'll also be asking some questions. And so you are welcome to kind of answer them in chat. Sometimes it helps us grow our knowledge together, right, as a community. So one of the things we know helps us protect us from things like vicarious trauma is when it's normalized within our work situations, within our work relationships, right? So when somebody else says, yeah, that happens to me too, one of the things it does is it takes it away from like, this is something that's defective with me, into, oh, this is what my work has exposed me to, and kind of the experience that I can expect to have or that I do have because of that work. Okay. I would love to know from you what you would like by the end of this. So feel free to put that into chat. If there's anything specific that helps me kind of focus what we're going to talk about. And also if there's something that you want to get out of it that we aren't going to cover, because it's very brief, right? We're kind of like a stone skipping across the water in the next hour. But then I can also maybe give you some resources around it or answer it up front or something like that. And Chris, feel free to jump in and just name those things once people put them into chat. So what would you like to know by the end? Another way to answer this question is, what is it that you're hoping will be different for you, right, after we talk during this hour? Okay. So I don't know. Let me see if I can open chat here.
It looks like Michelle Chase said organizational approaches.
Oh, great. Yep. So we'll spend the second half on that. Perfect. We're going to talk about that for sure. And I'm also going to not just to talk about organizational approaches, but just how also how vicarious trauma actually affects organizations. Because there's actually a whole effect that happens within systems when we're working with people who have experienced trauma, right? So when we're exposed to trauma. And this would also be true if there's a primary trauma in your workplace, right? So if you're actually having experiences where your systems are overwhelmed.
Someone said they want less anxiety, best practices to mitigate vicarious trauma, combating and validating statements, prevention strategies.
Gotcha. Okay, those are helpful to know. Thank you. I'm wondering from you, I would love to hear something about like what makes your work difficult. So what is it about where you work that makes it feel hard? Maybe somebody mentioned anxiety, which is actually a really typical response when we're talking about compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma or burnout, right? That's something I see a lot with clients. You can also have traumatized systems where like there'll be anxiety in the system, right? So the whole organizational system. So what is it that makes your work, your day-to-day kind of difficult? And maybe like a way to think about this too is what makes your work different than other jobs people have, right? So what is it about working where you're exposed to trauma that makes your job different? And I'll just give you a minute to chuck things in there. And Chris, feel free to jump in if anybody's saying anything here.
There's lack of predictability,
Yeah.
not knowing outcomes, so that goes hand in
Yeah.
hand. Volume of tasks needed to be completed in a short time, so it's hard to prioritize everything when everything is a priority. Clients that may be violent with staff,
Mm-hmm.
and with workload, no time to debrief or do self-care.
Yes. Gotcha. So the part where, so all those things are true. So unpredictability can increase things like um, compassion because it's associated with vicarious trauma. Um, things like clients who are violent, that actually has to do with primary trauma, which can actually overlap with some of the vicarious trauma pieces. So thank you for that. My next question is, what makes your work good? So what makes your work worth doing, even though there's these really difficult pieces around it or challenging pieces around it? And then we're going to jump into talking about the actual vicarious trauma part. So hang in there. So what makes your job worth doing? And these are important questions because this is also about one of the big pieces around vicarious trauma is you have to know yourself. So you have to know what actually is the hard part for you because it's different across people, right? So when I talk to people, somebody might have a really hard time sort of navigating cynicism, right? Or navigating the PTSD part of vicarious trauma. So that means like they're having flashbacks around a client story they told them or something like that. And somebody else might be more leaning towards a compassion fatigue side of things. So while they might struggle with vicarious trauma in relationships, they might actually struggle with depletion the most, right? So really, so part of the key to any of this is actually knowing yourself. Is there anything in chat yet around what's good? What makes work good?
Yeah, there's a few overlapping as well. Ability to educate and empower clients, getting
Yeah,
to space for people in most vulnerable times, helping someone, helping families, using their skills to help others is rewarding. Basically, positive outcomes and making a difference in small ways.
great. Thank you. Okay. So let's talk about basic sort of concepts. And this is where I'll kind of explain what things are and where they kind of go. So in the workplace, so the blue side of this, right? This is our model of why vicarious trauma happens in the workplace. The blue side is sort of your typical workplace where there's not exposure to trauma or experiences of trauma. So you're going to have the things that are pretty typical of a workplace, things like work stress, things like there could be harassment, right? There could be burnout happening. All those things fit sort of within the typical box of workplace stresses. But when we're talking about exposure to trauma or actually experiences of trauma, what happens is stress becomes accumulative. So it piles on itself, right? So not only is a person dealing with the repercussions of constantly being subjected to other people's traumatic experiences or their own trauma in the workplace, but they're also dealing with sort of the typical stuff that happens in the workplace that might create some stress, right? So I wanted to be able to differentiate these concepts for you. So burnout is what happens in typical workplaces. It can also happen in your workplace. And it's just around sort of like physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion, right? It has some very particular sort of markers around it. So people typically work really hard at the beginning, and nothing changes. They're spinning their wheels, and there's a disengagement piece, right? When things stop working, and the way that impacts somebody is there's usually negative talk about self-worth. There's negative talk about their ability as a worker and their value and the way they feel about their work. They feel less competent to do their work. They feel less confident and competent to do their work. The reason I'm explaining these to you is because there's so much overlap with vicarious trauma, but we're going to swim mostly in the vicarious trauma pool here. I understand that you guys just had a training on this part, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. Compassion fatigue only happens to folks who are in helping professions, right? And it's when we're constantly asked to be empathetic and we're constantly asked to be compassionate. And there's a real erosion of sort of our mental wellness and our emotional wellness. And of course, that always translates into physical wellness as well, right? And we're just not able to refuel and regenerate. When I see this in folks, it can be pretty extreme. So with my patients, my clients, they'll often come in with pretty extreme things. So like they'll for example be driving to work, and they notice that when they cross the bridge on their commute, suddenly they're thinking about, wouldn't it be nice if I could just jump and I didn't have to think about this anymore? And those fantasies become bigger and bigger, and they start spending more time thinking about those things, right? So compassion fatigue can be very intense for folks, and recovery often takes a long time. When compassion fatigue started, like that concept started in the 1990s, and the research around it started with nurses who weren't able to sort of nurture their patients. That's how it originally started. And now it's become more this umbrella term that encompasses burnout, or some symptoms of burnout. It includes the original meaning of compassion fatigue, but it can also include vicarious trauma. And there is a bit of a conflict in how terms are used in the literature. So for my benefit, for our benefit, I'm just going to talk about kind of vicarious trauma and what happens around vicarious trauma. Even though I want you to understand that it fits under that big umbrella, it can include compassion fatigue, and it can be referred to as compassion fatigue sometimes, right? So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here with this. So what we're talking about when we're talking about vicarious trauma is indirect trauma. So this is trauma of exposure to other people's stories and other people's experiences of trauma, right? And there's two pieces to it. One piece is so your belief systems about the world and your view of the world will actually start changing based on your exposure. And it's a process that happens over time. They usually change around your sort of key, your core belief systems that we all have, and the core psychological needs that we all have. So these are things like belonging, these are things like control, these are things like your identity. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is where you'll have symptoms that actually mimic somebody who's had like primary trauma. So that means you wake up at night having a nightmare about something one of your patients or clients told you. That means that you take on the unsafe experience, right? Where your body, everything in you, your whole body is pinned to tell you something is unsafe, where when you look at the facts, it's actually not unsafe, but your body's like responding as if it's traumatized, right? Because it's vicariously traumatized, right? So it include all those kinds of things, the same as somebody who has primary trauma. The tricky thing in my work, and that I see over and over again with people who work in human services where there is trauma exposure, is sometimes there's also primary trauma that's happening in the workplace. Sometimes people come into this field because they have a personal connection to it in some way. And so part of what happens for folks, and part of what I work on sometimes with clients, is their personal trauma keeps getting triggered, right? So they're constantly in the state of sort of hyper arousal or freeze, or however their traumatic response is showing up. So even though we're going to talk about this in sort of like a simplistic way, the vicarious trauma, I really want you to know that there's overlapping symptoms, and that those things can make your experience really complicated and really complex. When we can kind of recognize what we're experiencing, when we can reclaim part of it, when we know what to do with it, right? Part of what happens is that we can actually move into this other stage or alongside it called vicarious post-traumatic growth. And this also, like, this happens in workplaces, right? So this is where your sense of um, resilience might be enhanced. So one of the things um, I work with in clients who are experiencing vicarious trauma or who have their own traumatic material is that I get the deep privilege of witnessing their resilience, right? So we're not just talking about the event, we're also talking about how'd you get through it? How'd you do that? Right? So we have this like this privilege of walking that with people. And sometimes the way it can show up for our life is it can also show us how to navigate difficult experiences, right? And how to bounce back and all those kinds of things. It can help us gain a deeper sense of empathy and compassion. So one of the things I do is I work with abrasive leaders. So organizations will hire me to work with the leader. Often they're very competent in some areas and they hold very like important information or skill-based things for their organization. And one of the things that that work has done for me is it's really helped me gain compassion. So it doesn't mean there's a lot of accountability that happens, obviously, for change to happen. But the other piece is actually seeing what's underneath that. And usually what's underneath that is some kind of fear, right? So fear of being seen as incompetent or just feeling powerless in some way, right? So when we do this work, we also get exposed to things like empathy and compassion, and it can deepen our understanding of the human experience. It can shift our perspective and reshape our belief systems in a positive way, right? So it can help us understand more deeply human suffering, those sorts of things. And it can also help us sort of uh, like, so part of vicarious trauma is that we can take on the hopelessness that's associated with trauma. And so part of the growth can be around like being able to see the hope and being able to do the actions that create hopefulness within our systems. Okay. You can put this into chat or you can just think about it. I'm going to motor on here because we're already at 12:20ish. But to start thinking through for yourself. So I'm just going to go back to that. How does your work actually positively impact you? And how does it negatively impact you? So what are you noticing? The way to think about this is in your body, in your emotions, in your thoughts, and in your relationships. Those are the 4 things we look at, right? I want to explain to you the shift that happens more thoroughly. So the shift that happens when it comes to our major psychological needs like safety, trust, control, and intimacy, and then the other 2, identity and spirituality, is that, for example, so one of the things that's lost in trauma and vicarious trauma is our sense of safety. So safety in relationship, safety at work, right? Safety with our colleagues. I'll tell you what my experience of this was. So early on in my career, I worked on a victim link line, which means that all victims of crime would call our line, not all victims, but all victims of crime after the crime was committed had the option of calling our line. So they could be asking for resources, they could be debriefing, whatever the thing was, whatever the support they needed, right? We would try and provide it for them. And one of the things that happened for me around safety is there was actually a whole belief system that changed, right? So if I went to an event with my partner and we met people there and he would say, oh, that was so cool. It was so great to meet them. And I would go, yeah, but you never know. You never know. Right? And that was a shift in my belief system that was happening around safety. Another way that showed up is avoiding places where I knew crimes had been committed, right? Because it brought me into that vicarious trauma place where I was physically experiencing it, right? The unsafety. So my body's all tight, ready for flight or flight. It can change your level of trust, which is partly what I was describing as well, right? So safety and trust go together. One of the ways that happened for me is, so I did a lot of sports pre having kids, and I only did individual sports, and I didn't realize it until there's a psychologist who was doing some debriefing with us, and she pointed it out to me, and she said, "This is something that's changed from your work, And this is partly your belief system around things that's shifted, right? So this trust in the world has changed. And so part of my recovery, or my sort of like dance with vicarious trauma, was actually sports like soccer and sports like that were team based, where I actually had to be with people and trust people, because I had been doing things like running, swimming, climbing, like things that were very sort of individualistic, right? I guess climbing to a less degree. Okay. So thinking about sort of how your relationship with those markers is shifting. So how safe do you feel at work? How safe do you feel in your relationships? How trusting do you feel of other people? The other way it shows up is around control. So this is about like uh so there's two ways this shows up for people. One is doubling down on control. So with any kind of vicarious trauma or trauma in general, there's a sense of powerlessness. So sometimes people will double down on something they can control, things like money. Um, so, like being very rigid around money, food. There's you name it, right? People will double down around control. The other way this can show up is people start acting out the powerlessness of their experience. So a lot of impulsiveness, right? So online shopping, pornography addiction that's really interfering with life, right? All those things. What happens with intimacy is we stop being able to feel connected. And one of the markers is actually that, like, when you go to something like a family gathering or get together with friends and you just feel like you can't connect, and you just feel like they don't really understand you, or they don't really understand your work, or the conversation, the kind of conversation that's happening just isn't like, it's not deep enough, right? So when people talk about their kids or their home renter or whatever, you just can't relate to it, right? Like, because what happens with our work when we're exposed to a lot of traumatic material is our radar shifts, right? So we have this big shift that happens. Okay. The other part, of course, is the PTSD part. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because people typically know about this. So this is a lot of avoidance activities, avoiding emotions, numbing out, binge watching tons of shows, scrolling all the time so you don't have to feel anything. It can also be really complicated because one of the ways people cope is sometimes through substances. So like I have to smoke weed when I get home, or I just can't come off my day, right? Or I have to drink a bottle of wine. The reason that's complicated is because usually in our workplaces, there's no place to actually say that where it feels safe, right? Where it feels like I can tell people what's actually up with me because of my work, right? That's what kind of makes it complicated, because there's that hidden part of it. Okay. For yourself, just thinking through sort of what is resonating with you, I want to give you the main piece here. So the main piece around this, and this doesn't fit for everybody. I know some of us just have to do our jobs, but what research says is limiting our exposure to trauma is the best intervention, the most effective intervention. Sometimes what that means for people, I've worked with clients where what we've come to at the end of that is that they're going to work part-time hours at this job, right, where there's lots of trauma exposure, because usually folks are very passionate about their work. They want to do the work. They're just having these experiences because of it. And then half the time they're going to do event planning or something, right, where there's not so much exposure. So it can be that way. Sometimes organizations can also do this, where they can work with teams around like having different jobs they do in the day. Or if there's this particular client or patient where there's lots of trauma exposure with them, or a group of patients or clients, the organization will work to kind of limit that. There's often limits the organization has in that capacity, right? Other ways you can limit it is be very mindful of what you're taking in terms of like TV shows, movies, scrolling, books, right? That we're not continually traumatizing ourselves. And then the other piece is being careful around debriefing. So, what happens a lot in organizations is, hey, whoever, Michelle, guess what so-and-so just told me, right? Because we're thinking about it because now we've had this traumatizing sort of story, and then we pass it on. So I don't have any slides on this. In my longer trainings, we talk about this a lot. But one of the things we can do is set up an organizational culture around debriefing. So this is around asking for consent, right? So I have this thing that happened to me. Can I Can I tell you about it? Here's the outline. It had to do with domestic violence. You okay with that? And it gives your coworker an opportunity to say yes or no, right? Um, so those are kind of three ways that you can think about limiting your exposure. I want to talk a little bit about how you get it, because how you get it is also how we're going to intervene, right? So we all have these mirror neurons in our minds. And mirror neurons are like, I know you guys in the medical field, you probably know this, but like, if I take a glass of water, I yawn, right? Other people do too. So what happens with trauma is that we take on the posture of somebody who's telling us a traumatic incident. We literally take it on. So we start looking like them, right? Hunched over, closed down. And our body is literally responding to the unsafety of it. So we take it on in our posture. Sometimes we take it on in our voice, right? So we're mirroring the physiology. We also can mirror the emotions. So we actually take on those emotions. We take on the emotion of fear. We take on the emotion um, uh, of, sorry, we take on the emotion of fear. We take on the emotion of powerlessness, right? And we embody them. So it's not just that we know what it's like to feel that, we're actually feeling it ourselves, right? And then we can also take on the behavior of those things. So we can feel powerless ourselves, right? Our whole system takes on that powerlessness. When somebody mentioned workloads, sometimes there's an organizational culture around powerlessness when it comes to workloads, right? So we're actually integrating that into our whole system. I'm just watching the time here. If you have a high tendency for empathy, you probably also have a high tendency for something like vicarious trauma. That's not true for everybody. That's true sometimes for some people. There are two strategies I want to give you. One is how to uncouple sort of somebody else's trauma from how you're feeling, right? So what we actually want to do, there's two ways in, two gates I'm thinking of. One is through your somatic, your body experience, because trauma is all often caught and trapped in our bodies, right? And often when I work with people who have trauma or vicarious trauma, part of the stress of that is that some part of their physical response to things feels out of control, feels like they don't have control over it, right? And so it's actually tied pretty closely sometimes to shame. But here's some strategies. So one is that you have to remember that this is not happening to you, that this has not happened to you, has not happened to anybody you love. This actually happened to somebody else. So you can absolutely take their perspective and you can say, I understand what this would feel like without imagining it actually happening to you. The other thing to do is you need to get in your body in that moment. So when I have clients who are telling me some really tough stuff, if I notice my body responding sort of in the fight or flight freeze mode, right? So I want to get out of there. I'm shutting down, something like that. I absolutely practice this stuff. So one is peripheral vision. So what you want to do is look at a spot in front of you. So like I have a little light here that shows me my camera's on. So just look at a spot for a moment. So you're looking ahead. So you can imagine that's your client, right? And then what I want you to do is actually bring in your side vision. So when we bring in our side vision, I have like a whiteboard here so I can see it even though I'm looking at the dot. It's like, pretending it's a client, right? So I'm listening to them. I can go between, I can kind of swing between what they're telling me and my own response, right? So there's a pendulation happening in the interaction. And I can bring in this side vision. So on the one side, I have a whiteboard, I have some books. So even though I'm looking at them, I'm also bringing in the side view. And there's a physiological reason for that. When we're in fight or flight or freeze, our vision becomes very narrow. It's evolutionary. It's about getting away from the threat. So if I'm hoofing it from something that's scary, right, I'm not going to notice all the trees and all the vegetation, all the things. I'm just going to try and get away. So what this does is it physiologically tells our body that we're actually okay. You can couple that with something like, actually, that's nothing, there's no crisis happening right now, right? This is a story, and start distinguishing between sort of reality, what's happening in this moment, and the story, right? But this is a somatic, this is a body way to do it. The other way to do it, or you can do this as well, if you can hold your attention with all these things, you're welcome to. It's a bit like lifting weights, so it can be a bit challenging, is to do any kind of grounding exercises. There's all sorts we can do. Um, but one of them that I practice on the reg is feeling into your feet. So you can do it right now if you like. So this is just about feeling your feet on the floor, right? Feeling yourself grounded in this moment. So what are the pressure points? What are the temperatures? Maybe you can feel your socks in your shoes or your feet on the ground, right? So when you're talking to a client, you can actually look at them, bring in your peripheral vision, and if your attention can hold it all, you can also feel into your feet. And your whole body might go, oh, I'm actually okay in this moment, right? And we're not holding that trauma in the moment. In terms of long-term unmirroring, what we want to do is actually build awareness. So I would really encourage you, if I was going to give you homework, I would say in your next interaction with somebody where you're hearing a traumatic event, right? Where you're taking on that trauma that they're talking about, I want you to pay attention to what is happening in your body, right? So how does your body actually feel? How do you actually describe that? So when we name something, we actually tame it. And there's a brain integration that happens from our left foot and right that fights against the traumatic response, right? It makes it not traumatizing. So we want to name what's actually happening. So my shoulders go up. I can hold the tension in my chest. I feel the tension, right? The other thing I would say is what emotions are actually there. So emotions we feel through sensation. What's actually there? And then we want to think about our thoughts. Oh my God, I can't believe that happened for them. What if that happened to my kid, right? We want to start building awareness. And then we want to think about, how does this actually impact my relationships? Excuse me. So we want to start building that body awareness. We know that trauma and vicarious trauma get locked in the body. And the one way that we can sort of close that cycle, because you have all kinds of physiological pieces that go along with being exposed to trauma, we want to make sure we're doing something physical every day. So whether that's walking, taking the stairs to work, running, dancing, yoga, whatever feels good for you. It can be massage, it can be acupuncture. That connection to body is really important and actually helps us process the vicarious trauma that we're exposed to. The other thing I would say is visualization can be very helpful. So when you've had an experience with a client, you're like, whew, right? Or you recognize like, yeah, that's part of the trauma that's happening. Somebody tells you about abuse they've had, somebody tells you something, right? You can visualize a number of things. Different things work for different people. Some people visualize like swimming through water and all that stuff coming off of them, right? So we create kind of a cognitive distancing around it. You can shake it off. Shaking's great. There's a whole intervention around it, because part of the way our body comes out of fight or flight or freeze, which is part of what happens around vicarious trauma, is through shaking. So being able to, like, as part of your end day ritual or whatever, right, transitional ritual, to just shake everything off. There's been some research around transition rituals. It's really helpful in uncoupling. And that means that you have a ritual around thinking a little bit about your day, thinking about what happened, feeling the feelings of those things, and then moving on, right? So I worked with this, or I have a friend, I didn't work with them. I have a friend who worked in palliative care as a social worker. And one of the things they did is they had a little, I don't know, like altar or something set up in their walkway into the home. And they had some candles there. And they would light the candle, think of the patient that died, feel the feelings, blow out the candle, go up and change, right? As a way to mark the end of the day. There's all kinds of transition rituals. And if I asked you about them, there'd be lots in this group, I'm sure. But thinking about sort of having a transition ritual. I want to move into talking a little bit about Okay, I'm going to talk about organizational stuff. I have some extra slides there for you because I think it's really helpful. And you're free to go over them as you like. I want to talk a little bit about collective trauma and what that looks like. So this is collective vicarious trauma. So this happens, right, when we have a collective experience. So we all experience this together of overwhelm, right, of the organizational defenses and protective structures, and they leave your organization vulnerable and helpless. And it can lead to real damage. This is interpersonal damage between relationships. This is damage in the organizational systems. This is personal, like crisis, mental health crisis, right? And this comes from Pat Vivian and Shanna Horman's work. And part of the way that organizations can become traumatized is when they're serving a population where there's a lot of trauma, right? And it can happen in lots of ways. So one of the hallmarks of vicarious trauma in an organizational culture, there's lots of high drama. So staff don't know what to expect. There's high sensitivity to each other's moods. There's a lot of feeling like you're walking on eggshells, right? So there's a lot of intense reactivity and there's widespread stress. So everybody's stressed in the system. With the organizations I work with around vicarious trauma, like I work with a lot of mostly human service-based organizations. And what I see is that often the people who come into this work, they do it for a number of reasons, but many times they're highly mission driven, right? And there's a lot of altruism. So they're really the people that are caring. With altruism often comes like a crossover into codependency, right? Where we're taking on more than what's ours with clients, with patients, with other staff. And the work that the people do in the organization often depends on your ability to be empathetic, right? So you have these intense connections with clients and patients, and then you also have really intense connections between staff members, right? Sorry, I'm just trying to move my little marker here. Staff often try to sort of survive the intensity, the emotional intensity of the workplace by hunkering down. Usually that includes isolating or disengaging in some way for survival, right? It can look like leaving the organization. If there's a lot of turnover, what happens sometimes is there's a turnover in the leadership, and that doubles down on the instability that's already happening, right? In one organization I worked with, there was just such a fundamental lack of trust between staff. Staff didn't feel like they could be open with each other. They didn't feel like they could trust each other. And to do any of the sort of vicarious trauma interventions, organizational interventions, you have to start with that one. So you have to start with that. There can be many reasons for that, right? So this is a simplistic sort of model of that. There can be many reasons for that, but you have to start with the trust. You have to start with the safety, the emotional safety, because you can't build like one of the interventions for vicarious trauma is having a peer-based system, right? Where you can talk openly about what's happening with you, about what you might need to do to manage that thing, to process through your exposure, some of your belief systems around things, right? So that piece has to be in place. Often what happens is clients' trauma is actually mirrored in the system. So for example, if there's hopelessness, right? Sometimes when I work with organizations, clients, the staff of the organization will feel hopeless that anything will change. So even if they report the bullying and harassment, they feel hopeless that will ever change anything, and that's often mirrored. When I work with crisis-oriented organizations, often the mirroring system is a crisis-based system, right? So we're integrating that that stress that we see that's connected to trauma in the whole system, right? And I hope that like what you're starting to see through this is that yes, there's things you can do. Yes, there's your personal experience. But I'm also hoping you'll see that like kind of lift the gaze a little bit and see that this might be an organizational wide issue, not just a you problem, right? There's often lots of shame and guilt in the system. So shame around leaving, shame around disengaging, shame around not being able to show up for patients in the way that we want to, right? Okay, just trying to move my slide here. So I want to talk a little bit about intervention. And I gave you an exercise there, your handout, that might be helpful for this. So this is something I've done this, I haven't done this exact exercise with the organization. I do something very similar to this. But thinking about sort of your organizational strengths. So one of the things I really notice when I work with organizations is either they're problem saturated, right? Or they just want to look at the good stuff and it's hard to kind of think about the negative stuff. So this is for you to do. You can do it on your own. You can do it as a team. You can do it as an organization. This is where we start thinking through like, what is your organizational strength? So for example, your organizational strength might be that you're very client-centered or patient-centered, right? If you turn that coin over, there's going to be a backside to it, right? And this is usually the thing that makes it hard to be in that workplace. So it could be that because we're patient-centered, there's not a lot of boundaries between work and home. So people are texting when you're off shift, or maybe there's like, you know, if you take a day off, there's guilt around it, right? You kind of get guilted around like, oh, well, you shouldn't really be taking time, you know, like that kind of stuff. Even if it, sometimes that stuff's really under the waterline. So it's very passive. So they don't really say anything, but there's like this feeling on the team or in the organization that you really shouldn't be taking time off, that, you know, when you do that, you're putting extra load on your colleagues, right? So that could be the shadow side of being client centered, that over functioning unclear boundary side. This is a really helpful exercise in starting to get at like, what are the things, how is trauma actually showing up, right? Like what are the ways that we're actually seeing this in the system? So this is an awareness exercise. So you name the strengths and you name the shadows, because this will give you kind of a little bit of a path, a little bit of insight into what's happening. There's three principles when we're thinking about organizational trauma. So this is vicarious trauma in your organizational system. There are three kind of intervention or three principles of interventions that we're going to think about. And there's lots of interventions in each one of these. The first one is we want to think about sort of restorative vicarious trauma, or you could also say like vicarious trauma informed practices throughout your organizational structure, right? So there's some really interesting research that shows that leadership that can anticipate and respond to staff needs has lower levels of vicarious trauma in their staff, right? Leadership, I also like to say this, that leadership will bear the brunt of the staff emotion, the vicarious trauma. So this often gets sort of focused on leadership. And what I want to say to you, if you are in a leadership position, so this is formally or informally, what I want to say to you is you need to get your own support systems going. So your own emotional, professional support systems. So where do you go to tell your stories? Often when I work with leadership teams, when we do some of the work around vicarious trauma, what we find out is that actually we also experience vicarious trauma in leadership because we hear all the stories from our staff, right? And often we've come up through the service part of the organization to be in leadership. And that leadership can also feel like take in that powerlessness because, or HR, right? Because even if we know what we're looking at, sometimes we can't get people on the board, on the leadership teams to actually listen to us around it, right? So there's this like stuck piece, and I want to say that that's not uncommon, and that it's really important for you to find your support systems around that. So colleagues that would understand you, mentors that would understand kind of the context of your work. Having structured protocols in place, right? Where you case review, where you allow the team to reflect and to support each other, helps counter the impact of vicarious trauma. It's really important with anything with vicarious trauma to normalize the experience and to name it with staff in a team as a leader, right? I think what you're experiencing is vicarious trauma, to have language about around it. That's why these courses are so important, because they actually give us a collective language around what's happening. So we can identify it interpersonally, or personally, interpersonally, and collectively, what's actually happening, right? We want to make sure that people obviously have access to sort of like mental health services like counseling or EAP programs or things like that, right? So that they know where to go, but also that it's normalized within our culture, our organizational cultures, that it's okay to go do that stuff. And in fact, if you work in this field long enough where you are exposed to other people's trauma or traumatic incidents in the workplace, you probably will need some support around it, right? Some professional support around it. One of the biggest things management and upper leadership can do is, of course, help staff manage their workloads, because it's such a huge part of vicarious trauma and it doubles down on the experience of vicarious trauma. So that includes what we talked about before and sort of reducing the exposure. But it can also mean managing difficult caseloads or diversifying caseloads, right? We want to think about training and education. So we want to think about taking courses, maybe a longer version of this, where there's actually skill development around resiliency, right? Around what we're going to do to manage the vicarious trauma. Downstream, we want to create structures where we're talking about vicarious trauma, normalizing it from the get-go. So we're asking, when we onboard people, we're asking questions like, tell me what you already know about vicarious trauma, right? We want to start, we integrate that language early on. So when you sit down as a team and we talk about, what are you experiencing? How is this showing up for you? By the way, on teams, when people are experiencing something like vicarious trauma, sometimes it shows up as total disengagement, right? From staff, from clients, from other. And sometimes it shows up as enmeshment. So I'm over invested in clients. And I'm feeling like, I'm the only one that can really help this person, right? So we need to actually address that as teams. So when I do accountability exercises with teams and groups, we talk about like, how does this show up for you? How does vicarious trauma show up for you? How do you think it might be showing up in your team systems? And then we talk about like, when those things show up for you, what do you need from the rest of us? Right? Like, do you need someone to kind of sit with you? Do you need to have some space? Like, do you need to take a 5-minute break? Like, what do you actually need in that moment? And how are we going to do this together as a team? That's the we do it together piece, the collective intervention stuff, right? With any kind of trauma, what happens is the safety goes down. And we want to think about two things at work. We want to think about physical safety. So this means that people physically feel safe in the workplace. And I don't know what that means for your particular context. It can mean many things in different contexts. Sometimes it includes sort of creative problem solving around things, right? Because there's limited funding or whatever the thing is. This means like safety with clients and patients, but also safety with each other, right? So physical safety between coworkers. I don't know if you'd be surprised by this, but when I started doing the bullying and harassment work, I was surprised at how many people I spoke with in organizational contexts who didn't feel safe with their coworkers. Right? There's that uncertainty piece that was coming in where they were just feeling really unsafe around it. If you're having issues with like the more psychological parts, there's the physical safety. So we want to, maybe it means, I don't know, putting in a security system in the parking lot at night, right? But we also want to think about the psychological safety part. If you want to drop into chat and put in like where you sit on how safe you feel psychologically in your workplace on a scale of 1 to 10. You're welcome to do that. You don't have to do that. I know there's often like overlapping relationships in these webinars, but just thinking for yourself, like how safe do you actually feel, right? So how safe do you feel to express your real thoughts and feelings? How safe do you feel acknowledging a mistake you made with a patient? How safe do you feel, yeah, talking about what's going on with you, like how vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue is showing up for you, right? I know somebody at the intro was saying like, we don't have time to debrief. And what I will say is that's an organizational issue. And if your organization isn't providing that for you, find a place, find someone where you can do that. So you can make an informal agreement with a coworker. You do it after work for 10 minutes. You can find somebody who also works in a similar field as you, but not in the same workplace. But make sure that you're looking after yourself in that context. Of course, we want to be able to set aside specific time with teams where we are debriefing around what's happening. So not just what happened, but how you felt about what happened and how it's showing up for you, right? So how does it impact your working relationships with coworkers? How does it impact your work with patients? And how is it impacting your belief system about the world, right? So if we're a more informal setting, or not informal, a more face-to-face, like talking setting, we would talk a little bit about this, right? How physically safe does it feel? How psychologically safe? What are the indicators of that for you in your work? And then the last thing we kind of want to talk about is being able to bring back into vicarious trauma. We want to bring back in hopefulness. And we want to give voice to things, because part of what happens around vicarious trauma is the feeling of powerlessness. And people start having belief systems about how, it doesn't matter what you do, it won't create change, right? So there's a number of ways we can do this. Part of it is that team accountability we were talking about, right? So what are we experiencing? How best can we manage this together? What does success in this work actually look like? What kind of trauma or vicarious trauma or trauma are we experiencing together? And how can we actually manage it together, right? It can mean having work teams, committee work, specifically around organizational culture, specifically around sort of dealing with vicarious trauma. Bringing in relational approaches to manage performance systems, right? So absolutely want to manage performance, want to manage conduct, right? So when vicarious trauma gets in the system, often we have a very, well, I guess you'd call it toxic culture, right? So we want to make sure that we're also bringing in sort of performance management also means conduct management, and that we're bringing in a relational coach approach, accountability-based systems. Okay, so I'm just at the end of my time. I'm happy to answer any questions that pop up for you. I'm going to stop share. If you want my information, it's here. I'm happy to answer any questions or connect with you and support you in any way that I can. And I'd love to know from you what you want to take from today. And I'll answer any questions as well. Let me just, I can totally do the question part now, because I see there's a Q&A. Let me just see. Okay, how do you navigate the difference of debriefing how things are showing up for you and how it feels, but also knowing that sometimes I'm having a good day and then support my coworkers? Yeah, and it makes me feel, oh, I gotcha. So, yeah. So what you're saying is, how do I balance out wanting to be there for clients and also, or like, sorry, how do I balance out how things are showing up for me and needing to debrief that with somebody, and then having someone debrief with me, and then it brings me low? So what I would say about that is there might be personal work to do around that, in terms of like taking on other people's stuff. And maybe it's like kind of getting mixed up in your stuff because you work in the same, work setting. So you might be being like exposed to similar stuff. The thing with debriefing is, you can say, if you have a culture around debriefing, where you're asking for consent, you can say no. You can always ask to be treated the way you want to be treated. So if you're worried that that's bringing you down, you can, I know this is really difficult. So I'm saying it like it's easy. Like it's simple, but it's not easy to do, right? But actually having a conversation around like sometimes I'm okay with it and sometimes I'm not. And this is what I need, right? And I know that in a work context that can feel like a big risk because you're actually asking for what you need. And there's also the emotional, social relationship part that goes with that. That's why I always encourage organizations to have open group collective conversations about how you're going to debrief, right? Because we want to make whatever's implicit explicit. So whatever's under the surface, we actually want to label that. Yeah. Is there anything else coming up for people? Oh, you're welcome. I see some questions around that.